Hello, everyone. My name is Juan Moreno, and I'm the director of the Bankinter Innovation Foundation. Thank you for joining us today in this webinar on mistrust, factors, consequences, and solutions. For those of you who don't know the foundation, we have been working since 2003 to transform society through innovation. And we achieve this goal through our ecosystem of innovators and via our programs that address very different angles. First, from the education perspective, through our academia program and all the actions we carry out with universities. Then with companies, thanks to the Creciendo Foundation, which seeks to offer middle market companies support in their growth journeys. Also through our startups program, which, by the way, just recently launched the 2020 Annual Investment Trends Scene Report, which I recommend reading, and you can find in our website. And finally, through the Future Trends Forum, we takes us here today, where we seek to create value by anticipating innovation trends that will change our future and that will later transfer in events like this webinar. We are holding this event as part of the launch of our latest Future Trends Forum report from our experts on trust in the digital era, which also you can find it on our website along with the agenda for this series of online events. The report focuses on an issue as essential as trust and raises the main challenges that the public and private entities face when rebuilding. And of course, this is also the core theme of this series of webinars, Rebuilding Trust. Today, we are honored to have with us two of the experts who participated in our Future Trends Forum. Ethan, Alex, welcome, and a big thank you for being with us today. Let me just introduce you. Ethan Zuckerman is not only an expert on trust, but he also led and moderated brilliantly our last Future Trends Forum on this topic. Ethan is Associate Professor of Public Policy, Communication and Information at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and founder of the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure, a research group that is studying and building alternatives to the existing commercial internet. He's an expert on trust, and I recommend his last book on the topic, Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provide the Tools to Transform Them. Today, he will give us an overview on how trust is created, how trust is lost, and how trust has evolved over time. Thank you, Ethan. And Alex Heath is the US Head of Social Impact and Sustainability at Edelman, one of the international references in trust evolution and tracking. Alex will explain today the evolution of trust among different actors and across the main sectors. The agenda for today is that Ethan and Alex will run first their presentations, at the end of which we will hold a Q&A session. We will try to finish at 5 p.m. Madrid time o'clock. And you can start, for all the audience, you can start posting your questions either on the chat or in the Q&A section of the Zoom. Thank you. Well, without further ado, let me hand over to you, Ethan.
Sure. Juan, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be back with you. I really enjoyed having the chance to sort of work on the Future Trends Forum with you. As you mentioned, I just finished writing a book on trust, and specifically on mistrust. What happens to institutions when we lose trust in them? What are the implications of that? And unfortunately, this is a very timely moment for that conversation. In my country, in the United States, trust has dropped very sharply, really just in the last few months, although it's dropped in a very specific way. People from the conservatives, from the Republican Party who supported President Trump, their confidence in the US election system went down very, very sharply when President Trump failed to win re-election. You can see the Democrats' confidence increased somewhat, but we now have roughly 1/3 of Republicans who have a lot or some trust in the US electoral system, what that means is that 2/3 of Republicans have very low trust in the electoral system. And we've already seen the consequences from this. Recent polling suggests that 2/3 of Republicans believe that the 2020 election was stolen. Within our lower house of Congress, 2/3 of Republican representatives voted against certifying the election. So with their votes, they essentially said that they believed that the election was stolen. And maybe it was not a big surprise that some people affiliated with the far right in the United States invaded the nation's capital and tried to stop the certification of the election. Um, Obviously, the good news is that the election continued. There was a transfer of government, but certainly we now have to take very seriously this idea that many people in the United States are mistrustful of the government and are mistrustful of the election process. Lest you think that the US is uniquely screwed up, I would point out that the US is the green bar in that equation there. It is a low to mid trust nation as far as the OECD countries go. In fact, there's a lot of other countries that come up substantially lower in trust than the US, including Spain. And when we get down really low into Italy and Brazil and Greece, we're dealing with countries with extremely low trust. One thing that I like to remind people is that trust can be trust in different institutions. The real danger in some ways is that we seem to be losing trust in democracy itself. This was a really remarkable study by a couple of political scientists a few years back called Democratic Deconsolidation. Here's how to read those graphs. When you ask Americans who were born in the 1930s, 75% of them say it's very important to live in a democracy. Once you get down to Americans born in the 1980s, so the sort of students that I teach and younger, it's down around 30% who believe that it's essential to live in a democracy. So this loss of trust may be a loss of faith that the system that prevails in Europe and in North America is actually working. What we may be seeing is a loss of faith in democracies and a particular way of running financial markets, and that it may be getting worse over time because our young people are even less committed to these systems than older people are. I want to remind people that this did not happen overnight. In my country, if you look at this question of who has a lot of trust in government, so when you ask people, do you trust the government to do the right thing all or most of the time? That form of trust peaks in the middle of the 1960s, around 77%. But then it collapses in the US between the 1970s and the 1980s. Since then, it's recovered somewhat. We have a brief moment of high public trust under George W. Bush, right after 9/11, right before the US invades Iraq, and then trust has slipped back down ever since. All through the Obama presidency, 8 years of that, through 4 years of the Trump presidency, trust in government has never exceeded 20% in the US. So we are a very low trust in institutions. And what do I mean by institutions? I mean everything from the military, the police, the medical system, the public schools, the banks, newspapers, criminal justice, television news. These are all different institutions in society. And what's interesting to see is over the course of the last 30 years, in all but really one key institution, trust has gone down. In the US, our trust in the military has increased. And that's not necessarily a very positive side. That might actually be a very negative sign. In some of these other institutions, notably the medical system, the church and organized religion, particularly in Congress, our trust has gone way, way down, usually from a peak in the 1970s or the 1980s. So this is not just a phenomenon about government, it's really a phenomenon of anything that is big enough that you don't relate to an individual, you relate to the institution, to the entity, to the bureaucracy. We can even see this with small businesses, the second line in this chart. There's very high trust in small business, and in fact, that trust has gone up. The second from the bottom is big business. It's one of the least trusted institutions in the United States. My friends over at Edelman end up doing a ranking of trust globally. This is a couple years out of date, but I show it mostly to show that as recently as 2019, the US was sort of a middle nation in terms of trust. And that suggests that there's a lot of places where the situation with trust is actually significantly worse than the situation that we're facing in the United States. So why does this matter? Why should we care about trust? Well, one of the things that happens is that it's very hard to coordinate societal behavior when we don't trust in institutions. Right now, the US, like everybody else, is fighting against COVID-19. It's very, very hard. It's going to be very challenging in the US to persuade people to take the COVID vaccines because a large number of them, in many cases, some of the same people who supported Trump, have so low trust in the medical system that they are not only refusing to take the vaccines, they're actually sort of fighting against the distribution of the vaccines. So how did we get here? It's possible that one of the factors that has changed societally between the 1960s and the 1970s, when we had very high trust, and now, is that people are better educated. More of them have gone through high school, more of them have gone through university. There are more people who feel qualified to act as critical thinkers, to do their own research, to question positions of authority. And this may simply be a changing nature of the electorate. We may be changing to people who are more critical of authority. It's possible that the media environment is changing. We may have more information due to the internet, and obviously some of that is mis and disinformation, but more availability of information may help people feel like they can make up their own minds, like they don't have to trust institutions, like they can ask questions. It's worth noting that trust in the US starts sliding in the 1970s. It's hard to blame it on the internet in that case, but it might be very realistic to blame these changes in trust on different media attitudes, a more critical media, a less deferential media. It's possible that what's really going on is that this is a big social shift. Since the 1970s, the US is getting more unequal. It's getting harder for people who are not in the elite top 5%. And as inequality keeps growing, as people are more desperate, maybe more people find themselves rejecting a system that doesn't seem to be working for them. And then finally, we know that trust in institutions fall when those institutions fail. And the US has had some major institutional failures around COVID. We might look to countries that had a very serious death toll from COVID and expect to see some loss of trust coming out of those nations. The danger of very low trust is that the public can disengage from civic life. They can end up feeling like there's no reason to follow politics, there's no reason to follow current affairs, because there's really nothing that one can do about it. Another thing that seems to happen is in nations with very low trust, powerful individual leaders, people who are not representing a whole system, but who say, look, I personally have the power. I can personally solve this situation. These sorts of leaders gain enormous amounts of power and popularity. One of the things that we worked on as a group when we did the Future Trends Forum is something called the wallet experiment. And this is a way of thinking about the difference between trust in individuals and trust in institutions. And you can do it as well. Think about this idea. If you went out and you got a coffee at a cafe, perhaps in Madrid, perhaps in another city, and you left your wallet at the cafe, what do you think the chances are that you would get that wallet back? Sociologists actually use this question to measure a particular kind of trust. This is interpersonal trust. It's trust in strangers. There are three different types of trust that we tend to measure. We tend to measure how much do you trust your friends and family, how much do you trust strangers, and then how much do you trust institutions. We know that in many countries where interpersonal trust in strangers is very low, there's higher trust in institutions. There's the hope that the institution will help you out because your neighbor won't help you out. In China, for instance, most people answer the wallet experiment by saying, no, I'll never see my wallet back. But they actually have very high trust in institutions. Maybe if the corporation finds it, they'll send it back to me. There are some nations that have very low trust in interpersonal and in institutions. Brazil is sort of a good example of that. That tends to be very unhappy nations. One of the things that's interesting about the wallet experiment is that people are really terrible at estimating how much they should be able to trust their neighbors. When you do this experiment in Toronto, 40% of Torontonians believe that they will get their wallet back. But someone actually went out and did the experiment in person, and it turns out that you get about 80% of the wallets back. So one of the things that happens is that we are more mistrustful than we actually need to be. And we probably are giving up something of a happiness deficit. If we were more trusting, if we had a more realistic picture of how much we could trust each other and how much we could trust our institutions, we would probably be significantly happier in society. So what do we do with this information? We know that people trust less than they actually should. We know that that can be a serious problem for society. We also know that in most countries, China is sort of the rare exception, we are more likely to trust individuals than organizations. In almost every case, people trust their friends and family more than they trust organizations. But across the board, it's fairly rare to get the China case where we don't trust individuals very much, but we trust the organizations. Usually, if it has a face, we trust it more than something that is a bureaucracy. Trust, as my friend is going to talk to us about, tends to resist PR campaigns. Telling people to trust you more almost never works. Unfortunately, people can sort of sniff it out. In situations where people are really worried about recovering trust, there's probably a better way to do that, which is to help people try to become parts of systems. People trust institutions that they actually actively take part in. So we've seen this, for instance, within voting. Amongst both Republicans and Democrats in the US, people who actually participated in the process of administering an election ended up with very high confidence in things. So letting people in, letting them be part of the process is a way to try to figure out how to rebuild trust. Can we learn how to rebuild trust in the abstract? I think it's really hard. I think it can't just be a matter of waving your hands and saying, trust us. I think it actually has to be changes in behavior. And the closer people can see those changes, preferably if they can actually be part of those changes, the better chance we have of people really changing those dynamics of trust. So I just wanted to sort of share that outline for you, the sort of big takeaways, that in most societies, we trust the individuals more than the institutions, that there seems to be this big social change since the 1970s, that we are trusting less, and that there really are very serious consequences for mistrust. Trust takes a very long time to earn. It takes a very short time to break. And then thinking about how we change that situation, I'm going to hand off to my colleague to talk about that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ethan. We will have the Q&A later. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you, Juan. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works for everyone. Okay, hopefully you can see this. Great. So what I want to talk about today is mistrust across sectors. And Ethan mentioned Edelman. That's where I sit. I am the US head of social impact and sustainability. And you will find that I believe that social impact and sustainability are indeed the way that we can build trust. So, you know, I'd say after a year of unprecedented disaster and turbulence, you know, COVID-19 pandemic, the economic crisis, we've seen a global outcry over systemic racism. We've seen political instability. We see that there's an epidemic of misinformation. There's widespread mistrust of societal institutions and of leaders. This is everything that Ethan started to talk about, and this is happening in real time. So we see there's a failing trust ecosystem, and there's a challenge that we've seen, which is a rampant infodemic. It's leaving four institutions, the ones that we study, business, government, NGOs, and media, in an environment of what we see as information bankruptcy. But I think that they have a mandate to rebuild trust and chart a new path forward. And that's what I want to talk about today, not just doom and gloom, but how do we sort of move forward there. We've been studying trust for 20 years. And what's clear is now more than ever, I think the expectations have risen. So I'll make 3 points today. I think we've entered the era of trust. Trust matters more than ever for business and brands. I'm going to come at this from a business perspective. One reason for mistrust is I think there's a chasm between expectations and actions. And I think that purpose is that which can and should dictate and direct that action. And to ensure purposeful action builds trust, we want to focus on 3 things: authenticity, delivery, and transparency. So mistrust is on the rise, and business can act with purpose to gain it back. And so how do you start to think about the building blocks of trust, right? So we'd say that there's 4 building blocks of trust. They are ability, integrity, dependability, and purpose. And all of these elements are essential to building trust. But what we're seeing now is that there's this glimmer of hope in business, that as the world grapples with urgent and complex challenges, from climate change to inequality to systemic racism, trust has shifted. And our research shows that the most powerful element in trust is now purpose. Of those 4 previously, purpose is driving trust, right? It is the path to multi-sector trust. Where government is absent, people clearly expect business to step in and fill the void. The high expectations of business to address and solve challenges have never been more apparent. It is about doing the work and changes in behavior, not just talking about it. And these heightened expectations of business bring CEOs new demands to focus on societal engagement with, frankly, the same rigor, thoughtfulness, and energy used to deliver on profits. So specific to certain sectors and audience groups, we see that 86% of people who respond to our trust barometer expect CEOs to publicly speak out on societal issues. 90% of people want brands to partner with government and relief agencies, and 92% of US investors believe that business must lead on positive social change. So to build trust, business must act on societal issues. We're seeing 86% people say that business must not only address consumer needs, but also take meaningful action on the most pressing societal issues. So how do you get there? How do you become a company or a brand that's taking meaningful action on social issues? Well, first we have to articulate our purpose. And our purpose is an organization's reason for being beyond profit alone. It acts as a North Star, guiding when, where, and how, and why a business should act to benefit people and planet. It informs how you serve and engage with key stakeholders. It ensures that initiatives create both commercial and societal impact. So we are not talking about philanthropy on its own. We're not talking about classic CSR programming. We're really talking about something that is built in, not bolted on to a business, and how they actually deliver on these imperatives for societal action. At the same time, purpose has been buzzy in the business community for several years now, and it has to deliver on more than just promises, because I think there's a paradox, right? We can call on companies to become more purposeful, but empty purpose can be worse than no purpose at all. So if there's a disconnect between message and action, that can actually corrode trust. We've seen it time and again, right? We call it greenwashing. It can now be called, some call it purpose washing, as you see in the headline to the bottom right, or even I've heard woke washing, and I've heard blue washing and rainbow washing. All of this is around this rush to become a purposeful company without having done the work to actually build trust first. And so how do you do that? We need to look at this attempt to meet heightened expectations. We need to take advantage of that which purpose can offer and do that hard work to get there. So we have to have a purpose lens when building trust. And to ensure that this purposeful action resonates, I think we can focus in 3 steps or areas, right? Authenticity, delivery, and transparency. So for authenticity, it's about what is relevant and coherent for the business or brand to act upon. And do your stakeholder audiences see this as authentic to you? Is it what they would expect from you? Delivery, action must deliver real impact, either internally across the value chain or outside in society, or both. This is where we talk about companies' business must be the solution. This goes far beyond a PR campaign, as Ethan mentioned. And will that delivery be seen as trustworthy by your stakeholders? That entails having the right partners to ensure that any action is impactful and sensitive. And how you deliver and what you deliver here is key. And then transparency. All action must be followed by clear and consistent and transparent communications. And I think this is a simple, not easy recipe to build trust in this complex world. And what we're contending with are these sky-high expectations which raise the bar for action. So I want to share a few additional data points with you, which all come from our Trust Barometer studies. They're all publicly available on edelman.com. And these speak to some expectations of different groups of stakeholders. So for consumers, people say that they will buy or boycott brands in response to the pandemic, in response to their actions during the pandemic. So on the right side of the slide, you see the 40% say, I've convinced other people to stop using a brand I felt was not acting appropriately. And more specific to mistrust, aligning actions with expectations with regards to the pandemic is extremely important. You can even see that trust is at risk, because 71% of people say that brands and companies that I see placing their profits before people during this crisis will lose my trust forever. And this has real implications for future business strategy. What businesses do during the pandemic, beyond just getting on with it and delivering the day-to-day business, but how they're delivering for society beyond their walls, beyond their own supply chain, inclusive of their entire worker ecosystem, is clearly essential to long-term trust. Let's take another audience, investors. We see here that 89% of investors say that companies that excel in ESG merit a premium. 90% say that companies that prioritize ESG represent better opportunities for long-term returns than companies that do not. So actions driven by purpose improve trust from investors, which is an essential audience for many companies. And finally, for employees, we see a rise of this new employer contract, one that requires employers to offer through their work the ability to positively shape the future. This contract, I think, will continue to demand that employers speak out on issues and provide meaningful ways for their employees to get involved, both through their day-to-day work and beyond. So what does that mean? How do companies go a little bit further and think about this? I think that the depth and complexity of the social challenges we face and the high expectations of today, coupled with the transparency and the open communications that exist in our 24-hour news cycle and social media, and everybody can look up anything at any time, mean that business must deliver on expectations, but also go beyond expectations to differentiate, to build trust. And that differentiation and that delivery needs to be enabled by systems thinking approaches that demonstrate and accelerate the actions that will build trust for them and in society. So simple solutions to complex challenges are just not enough anymore. For business to enhance trust across multi-stakeholder audiences, business should be the solution. And actions must deliver on expectations or risk doing harm. Over the past 1.5 years, businesses faced this range of challenges, but I think there's also opportunity. Business can and should continue to invest in building trust. It's absolutely critical, not only for reputation, but also for valuation and employee engagement. So I think that purpose is the path to take to generate trust across audiences. So if one thing's become clear, it's that the bar for business has been raised to act according to multi-stakeholder principles and to rebuild equitably. In this post-COVID world, we're going to need all hands on deck. More action and more authentic action from the private sector is what's needed. So there's 4 key takeaways here for companies. 1, elevate the issues where you have a license to lead. Determine those places you can uniquely play or lead in, and lean in. Figure out that intersection between your purpose, your impact, and the culture or environmental shift that you can ignite. Number 2, solve, don't sell. Solving, not selling is important. In this wake of greenwashing and woke washing, brands are going to get called out on PR and communications tactics that aren't based in real insights and real action. Balance compelling stories with facts. Your approach needs to be based in the data, in facts, in real societal needs. And tension, and then how do you solve it? Or who you support can bring the emotion and the heart to your story. You have to approach this both rationally and emotionally. And finally, partner to build credibility and scale impact, right? Don't go it alone. We want to partner with experts, academics, NGOs, with government to address COVID-19 and vaccine delivery. The experts that are in the issues where you have a license to lead that may have a shared and mutually beneficial mission, right? I think trust remains the most important currency in the lasting relationships between the 4 institutions and their various stakeholders, but especially in business. Particularly in times of turbulence and volatility, trust, as Ethan talked about, is what holds society together. It's where growth rebuilds and rebounds. So while every institution must play its part in restoring society, I think business really has the opportunity to embrace its expanded mandate and expectations with CEOs leading on a range of issues. Thank you. That's it from me. And I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Alex. Let's start with the questions. We have a few in the Q&A. Let me just get started. And on the back of your presentation, Alex, you talked a lot about businesses, but I think there's one question that opens up to also governments and institutions, which is, are institutions and national governments really interested on recovering their citizens' trust, unless this lacks impact in their position on politics and thus their power? Who wants to take this one?
I mean, I think that Ethan can probably go deeper, so I will take it briefly, and then I'll allow Ethan to go a little bit deeper. But I think Ethan touched on it, and I think it's an interesting question, and my view is yes. My view is government is interested, but be interested in rebuilding trust in order to deliver on the societal programming and the societal services that government needs to deliver on. And very specifically, you can see that in vaccine delivery. And if the government doesn't continue to build trust or continues to exist in a state of mistrust, there's going to be an inability to solve the vaccine delivery conundrum, and therefore an inability to reopen and return to our normal way of life. So there's probably many answers in which the answer to that might be maybe no, maybe government doesn't care so much. But I think at this moment, when we're globally in this moment, when we're trying to deliver this vaccine and government needs to be able to deliver that, I would say, yes, government is very interested in rebuilding trust.
Yeah, well, and I think two things are going on, right? There's a almost 50-year-old trend at this point that started in the US and in the UK, which basically said government is the problem, it's not the solution, we should open more things up to the market, government should do less. You know, some people call this neoliberalism. There's a lot of different ways of talking about it. Really, all of us have sort of grown up under that paradigm, right? We've heard those arguments for so long that we sometimes forget that there are things that are really hard to do without central coordination of one fashion or another. Disaster recovery is really hard to do, particularly when you need something like coordination around a vaccine. And so I think in many ways, we have seen from this pandemic just the very importance of high functioning governments. I think that governments that have done particularly well in handling the pandemic, I think particularly of Taiwan, have actually seen huge increases in trust. And I think governments are looking at that and saying, wow, okay, with high trust, maybe we can have much bigger ambitions. Maybe we can work not just on recovering from disasters, maybe we can work on building new systems and building more infrastructures. So I think governments actually have a very strong incentive to rebuild trust. I think they're fighting a larger social trend that can be very hard sometimes to fight against. But I think this is a moment where government is sort of more important than it's been in a very long time for most people's lives. And I think that actually gives us a lot of impetus to go ahead and make change.
Okay, thank you. There's another question in this line, but I think you have pretty much answered it. So let me just jump now to another topic. What regulation to social media can help in rebuilding trust, if any?
So it's interesting. It's social media takes a lot of hits these days, and some of them are deserved, right? Social media is clearly not a very healthy environment. It's not an environment that's working very hard to make us better citizens. The flip side to all of this is that it is possible to blame too much on social media. In my country, at least, it's impossible to get rid of misinformation just by fixing social media, because misinformation is now the position of one of the political parties, right? The position of one of the political parties is that the election was stolen. And that's just not true. And so in some ways we've moved into a very different form of politics. We actually saw it in Poland first. One of the political parties in Poland believes that their president was assassinated by Russia. There's no evidence of that, but it's very strange. It's very hard to have politics when, you know, misinformation is sort of taken over. So part of this situation is a political situation. Only part of it is a technological or a media situation. As for the part of it that is a media situation, you know, the biggest thing is that it's crazy that we have our conversations about politics, civics, and the future in these spaces that are controlled by very few people. Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, these guys have way, way, way too much control over what is acceptable speech. Whether or not I think it made sense to kick President Trump off of Twitter, man, that's a lot of power to give to a company. And in the long run, that's not a healthy way for these things to work. My work at the University of Massachusetts is trying to rebuild social media so that it's actually governed by the communities that use it. And the trick to doing this is to build things that are much, much smaller. We don't know how to govern 3 billion people. No one's done it very successfully. We actually know a lot about how 30 to maybe 3,000 people can get together and govern themselves. And so I'm really interested in sort of trying to rebuild social media and what people call the digital public sphere around much smaller communities that can take care of governing themselves. But Alex, I'd love to hear, you know, how do you put yourself within Facebook, you know, put yourself within Twitter? How do these companies both take on misinformation, but also sort of follow your advice that it can't be window dressing, it can't be woke washing, it actually needs to be a genuine change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Facebook has taken some good steps with their external board that's going to help govern. But of course, as you say, who can actually govern these groups? I think that the challenge that they've faced, from my perspective, is inconsistent application of rules and governing values, right? Again, you know, taking President Trump off of Twitter, there was a reason for that, but there are also many other things that have existed on Twitter and on Facebook that may have crossed that same line that haven't reached that level of decision. So from my perspective, it's about being very clear about your values and your stance, and then taking that action and applying it consistently, and being very doing it everywhere in the world in the same way. I think there's also been a lot about how these companies have addressed issues in different countries in different ways, right? Especially, you know, we think about the misinformation that's happened in Myanmar that's been spread on Facebook and on WhatsApp. And so, you know, apparently they're doing an okay job at that now on Facebook, but I'm not the expert that you are, Ethan, but just from a strategy perspective, that's what I would say is ensure that the purpose is clear, that your impact is clear, and that you apply it directly. And I think the other thing that many of these companies are struggling with that they haven't quite wrestled with is a lot of, we talk about purpose, we talk about your role in the world, we talk about your impact that you have on the things that you do. One of the challenges for some of these tech firms, especially the social media firms, is the impact that they have just by existing. And it's not necessarily the impact that on anything that they do, it's the impact of their business. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is quite a lot of unintentional consequences and unintentional impacts that exist, especially from the tech industry, that I think businesses are just starting to grapple with now.
Okay, thank you. Let me just get to the next one. This is about misinformation. Is the storm around misinformation just an excuse to stifle free speech? Isn't the focus on misinformation just accelerating trust erosion?
It's a fascinating question, and certainly people like to complain that efforts to remove mis and disinformation are ways of controlling speech within a community. But I think what we're seeing, at least recently, is maybe a change in how platforms are sort of thinking about this. And I think the question really is, what's the possible damage of that misinformation? So you've seen platforms really go after two forms of misinformation recently. The first has been around the coronavirus. So this past summer, there was this quite crazy video called Plandemic. And it basically accused Bill Gates and Dr. Anthony Fauci and a bunch of other people of creating the COVID virus for their personal profit. And it also suggested that you shouldn't wear a mask, that was very dangerous. It had a lot of extremely dangerous information about the virus. And the major platforms, Google and Facebook and Twitter, just took it down really fast. It was up fewer than 36 hours. And this is unusual. Usually platforms will let things stay unless they are explicitly provoking violence, right? Usually what they want to do is sort of say the response to bad speech is more speech. But what they said in this case was, no, this is harmful. Like, people are going to follow this advice and they're going to get hurt. And so we're going to take action on it. The next place you saw a lot of platforms take action was around information that was designed to suppress the vote in the United States. So things that were really designed to say, it's pretty typical in the United States to say something like, if you go to vote, be prepared because you will be asked to pay all your past parking tickets, or if there's a warrant out for your arrest, you'll be arrested immediately. It isn't true, but it's designed in particular to persuade people who are economically vulnerable, often people who are Black or Brown Americans, from voting. And you've now seen the platforms get quite aggressive in pulling that down. So I think what we're seeing is just a real change of pace. I think simply getting rid of information because it's wrong is going to be hard. 95% of the internet is wrong, right? I think the question is it harmful and dangerous? And is it harmful and manipulative? This is what we're starting to learn, is that some of the people who are far-right extremists have gotten very, very good at manipulating the internet. And so it's not just that they're trying to give you bad information. In many cases, what they're actually trying to do is just decrease your confidence in everything. So this whole misinformation question has gotten much more complex and sophisticated. I don't think that the platforms are the way to solve this. I think the way to solve this ultimately has actually more to do with the mainstream media. I think one of the reasons we're obsessed with misinformation is because it's become the dominant story of our time. I think we actually are much more politically divided and politically suspicious than we are actually misinformed. And that what we actually have to deal with is the ways in which different groups of people really just don't want to acknowledge each other's existence. But I think misinformation sort of comes into these equations all the time.
Okay, Alex, do you want to add anything on that, or should I link this to the next question on polarization?
Let's keep going.
Okay, so the question is for you. Purpose is getting also polarized in the US.
Yeah.
Climate change, diversity and inclusion, equality are examples. How does a strong purpose can be used for building trust considering that polarization?
Well, it's part of the challenge in the work, of course. I think that, some of the things that we talked about earlier about how companies need to be very clear about what they can and should stand for, speak up on, and take a stance on. And then what is the work that they're doing, and be very clear around the purpose and the values and what's behind what the company is doing. I do think that almost everything is polarized. And what we have found in some research is that when companies stand up for what they believe in, and they're very clear, and it's based in their purpose, and they move things forward in the direction that they believe is right, they gain more than they lose. So they get more kudos, they get more engagement with their fans than they get detraction from their detractors. And so it is a calculation. And it's also why some companies are doing some work and then not totally communicating about everything that they're doing. It's also why many companies are, doing work in different areas that focus on different kinds of stakeholders. A lot of companies are focused on their employees first. This is important, but it's also less polarizing. So not every company is going to be, standing up and partnering with Greta Thunberg on climate change, but some will, and those who do are going to, I believe, get more. And we've seen from our data, will get more engagement from their fans and less detraction from their detractors. But it's a great question, and it's one that we grapple with every day, of sort of how far do you want to go, and what kind of company do you want to be, and how activist do you want to be, right? Are you, we have a bit of a scale we talk to companies about. Do you want to be a responder, an advocate, or an activist? And they're all very good positions to be in from a sort of purpose and engagement with issues perspective. But you very much have to look at the business that you're in, the expectations of your stakeholders, and the change that you can ignite, and the change that you want to ignite in both your actions and your communications.
Okay, thank you. Ethan, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think that's a great answer. I think we should let that stand and get on to the next one.
Okay. Alex, another question. I'm adapting the question. How, you talked a lot about the principles that companies should or could follow to rebuild trust. Can those principles be mapped for governments and other institutions to do the same, to recover and rebuild trust?
Yes and no. Business has a little bit more, probably the wrong word, but business has a little bit more control over how they choose to act. Government is a little bit more of a slow-moving organization, and also it depends on the kind of government we're talking about. If we're talking about a democratically elected government, et cetera. I think nonprofit organizations can certainly follow some of the same principles in an easier way. Nonprofits and business can probably follow similar principles. But government, I think, has a more challenging engagement strategy that needs to happen, especially in the more open societies, and especially in the more democratic societies. Now, business would be well advised to have an engagement strategy, but also business can take action, especially private businesses can take action in different ways. Then government can quickly turn the corner on things. That's my view. But Ethan, did you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do think governments can do is try to figure out how to involve citizens more in processes. I mean, this is something that we've just seen great examples of. I tell the story in my book of a friend in Italy who started a project called Monathon. It was about getting citizens to monitor government institutions. And he did this because he'd been involved with government transparency efforts. He'd published all this information on what government was doing. He won all sorts of awards for the work that he was doing, but no one used it. And so what he said was, okay, let's go out and we're going to do monitoring. We're going to monitor EU cohesion funds, right? And probably everyone on this call understands the EU cohesion funds are pretty controversial, right? People assume that there's a huge amount of corruption going on with them. So he would take out groups of people in Italy, they would go to a local project funded with EU cohesion funds, and they would meet with the team and they would try to audit the project. And what they actually found was that most of the projects were pretty well thought through. They'd been completed. Often they were completed on time. And they would write up these reports sort of saying, no, like clearly this is not a situation of corruption. And what's very interesting is when you ask the people who were involved with monitoring these projects, they got involved because they thought corruption was rampant. And they came out sort of convinced that actually there was surprisingly little corruption going on, at least with these funds. So governments absolutely can get people involved. They can do things like the way we do some things like elections in the US, where we really rely very heavily on volunteer labor to get them done. But even if you don't have situations like an election, you can do things like monitoring, where you invite people to hold you responsible. And even that, over time, can actually end up leading to an increase in trust.
Okay, thank you. And I think we only have now time for a closing question, which is more like your view or your forecast. I think the way the question is put is a little bit pessimistic. I think I want to ask you, what do you think the situation will be in 5 years' time, and in a 10 years horizon also? Do you think it's going to be the same, worse, or better? Are we in the right direction?
This is a hard moment to be too optimistic. On the one hand, here in North America, it's spring, it's sunny for the first time. Maybe the vaccine is going to stop the fourth wave of COVID, although we don't know. But I have to say, I have a lot of reasons to be very worried. We just came through 4 quite terrifying years politically, and a transition that could have gone very, very poorly. I think maybe the reminder that I'd like to leave people with is that we're in the middle of a 40 or 50 year pattern. And that pattern as a whole is pretty clear, to me at least. Our responses to that pattern are not especially clear. So I don't see any reason why that pattern would change unless there were a very concerted effort. The places where I do have some confidence are places where government and other large institutions have really been incredibly proactive and have steered the ship of state successfully. So I'm hoping that we can learn a lot from New Zealand, from Taiwan, from South Korea. I'm hoping we can sort of look at societies that have dealt with this last year or two with incredible success. And I'm hoping we can sort of unpack it and sort of say, what did they do to gain public trust? And how can we learn from that as other governments, but also as corporations and businesses? So not an optimist on the whole, but there's a path through that might be helpful.
Some silver lining there. Alex, any closing?
I realize we're over time, so I'll just add one thought to everything that Ethan said. I think that, you know, as if we continue to do what we're doing, we're not going to get to where we need to get to. And I would say that we can talk as much as we want around trust and polarization and what audiences think from business and what businesses should do and all of these things. But I think there are some pretty clear things that need to happen in this world. And there are some pretty clear roles for business to take from a social impact perspective, from a sustainability perspective. I think taking those actions and being bold is really the only way that we're going to both move out of this trust epidemic or lack thereof from a business perspective, and which we haven't brought up yet, and achieve things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which we know is a 2030 target date, and business is working on that. So I would just say business needs to, and we're slowly starting to see some of it, but business needs to put aside some of these concerns around polarization and actually just take some stands and be confident in the trust that they're going to build with their audiences, and they're going to gain new audiences. And if there are a few audiences that distrust them for a short period of time, I'd like to see business be bolder about that and just move forward, because we need bold action across the board to actually get us to the future that we need and deserve.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to both of you, and thanks also to our audience. We will meet again in the next webinar in the coming days. If you're interested, you can register in our website. Alex, Ethan, thank you again, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye.
Thanks for having us, Juan. It's always a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.